The Chesapeake Bay, the crown jewel of coastal Virginia, has been utilized as a passageway since the arrival of Native Americans. The Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel connects Virginia Beach to the eastern shore of Virginia. However, the bridge tunnel was not open to traffic until 1964. Prior to the bridge tunnel, the only way across the bay was by ferry boat. This is the story of the Virginia Ferry Corporation, the reason the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel was built.
I started working for the ferry company in 1947. And when I graduated from high school in June of 1947, a couple of schoolmates and I were hiking down the highway going over to Norfolk looking for a job. And going across the ferries was the Delmarva, and Capt. was captain on there, and I didn't know any of them. But when we got to Little Creek, one of my friends that I was with had worked on the Pennsylvania Railroad tugs, which is right beside the ferries. And he showed me Capt Mule. He said, "There's Capt Mule there." He said, "Go ask him for a job." And that's what I did. And I went to work on, he says, when I asked Capt Mule for a job, I told him who I was and everything, he says, "Come back Wednesday," which was several days from then. And so I came back Wednesday and started off as ordinary seaman on the Delmarva, 1947, June in 1947. I started off as ordinary seaman, which on deck. Did deck maintenance, painting and chipping and so forth, cleaning. And after a while, I took an interest in the pilot house. So I used to go up in the pilot house and learn to steer. And Capt Mule one day asked me if I wanted to be wheelsman. I said, "Yes, sir, I sure do." And so he took me to the pilot house, and I started with wheelsman. I was wheelsman. And then from there, I had to have 3 years sea time in order to get a license. So 3 years later, I took a Coast Guard exam for first class pilot for Cape Charles to Little Creek. And I passed it, and I got my first class pilot license, which enabled me to work as second mate. So I started second mate, and you had to use your mate's license 1 year before you could take an exam for a captain. So 1 year later, I went up and took a captain's exam for the Coast Guard, and I passed that and got that. When I got my captain's license, I think I was 22. And so I was 29 when I first used my captain's license. I went captain at 29. And then I stayed there until the ferries ran out of business. Ordinary seaman. Then I went from ordinary seaman to wheelsman, and then to second mate, and then first mate, and then captain. 12 years. About 5, yeah. Well, when I first started, they only had three boats: the Pocahontas, the Princess Anne, and Delmarva. Well, then as time passed and traffic increased, they had to add boats. The next one to come online was the Northampton. She was converted LST. And then more time passed, and they had to add another one. So they got the Old Point Comfort, and she was another converted LST. And she was built pretty nice. Had good accommodations, you know. And then the next one was the Virginia Beach. She was another converted LST. And then the Accomack, she was converted from an old railroad steamer. She used to be the Virginia Lee. And but she changed ownership several times. I understand that she was the holiday at one time, and she was working down in South America. And then she finally came back up here, and the ferry company got her, and they remodeled her bow to accommodate traffic going in and off. And she was different from the others. She was a twin screw but a single rudder, and she wouldn't maneuver like the other ferries. All of them. My favorite boat was the Pocahontas. I loved to maneuver her. She was very light, active. She could, in response to her engines, you could see her. The results of her engine, you could see her maneuvering, you know, and you could see it, as opposed to the Delmarva. The Delmarva was just like a dead piece of wood in the water. But the Pocahontas maneuvered very well. I used to love to maneuver her. And she was a little over 4,000 horsepower, twin screw, you know, twin rudder. The Princess Anne maneuvered well too, but she was not quite as active as the Pocahontas. Well, it depended. The Virginia Beach, she didn't want to stop her headway. You had to watch, but she didn't want to point her at anything. And the Northampton, I guess the Northampton was my least favorite. She was very uncomfortable. And the Northampton maneuvered okay as long as the wind wasn't blowing. But at the least little bit of wind, take off across the channel. You had to really allow, going into Little Creek, and I used to be first mate on the Northampton, going into Little Creek, and my wheelsman was a guy named A.C. Taylor, good wheelsman. And the wind was northwest, blowing sideways from the dock, you know. So we got in, and going into the channel, and the jetties in Little Creek. After we got in there a little ways, I said, "Okay, AC." I said, "I want you to come to your right, and then after you come to your right, you come some more." I said, because when we stop the engine, she's just going to fall. And then it did. And I said, I want to land her on this big bunch of pilots. And that's where I would land her every time. And then turn her and go on in the pier. Northampton was the worst one of all. She was so light draft, you know. Of course, they were all affected by the wind, very much so. Pocahontas had a lot of wind resistance too. Big, heavy side, you know, solid sides. Inclement weather, strong winds, and because those ferries very rarely ever tied up. And we had to watch out and had to take the wind and weather conditions into account with wherever we were on the ferry going to the dock or out in the bay. It was a lot of maneuvering. It was a lot of maneuvering in Little Creek, docking in Little Creek and undocking. The same thing in Capt or in Cape Charles. And so a lot of things had to be taken into consideration, weather conditions and so forth. And sometimes you had to dock or undock a little bit different from the last time due to a change in the weather conditions. So it had its interesting moments. I was talking to a co-worker, Elmer Ward. He used to be a mate down there. And he told me that he was on the Accomack in Little Creek. And during that Ash Wednesday storm, that the Accomack was tied up in number 3 dock, I think was number 3 dock in Little Creek. He said the Accomack wanted to go out of the pier and then back and forth. He had to watch her all the time. When she started to move, he had to come ahead on the engine to keep her in the dock, you know. That was kind of nerve-wracking, you know. But I wasn't working at the time. I think that was the time that they lost the Big D. that big crane working on the bridge tunnel. Yes, well, we ran through a lot of big storms, and in a strong northwest wind, we had some heavy wind seas, and in order to try to minimize the effect of the seas and her rolling, we would tack them like sailboats, run this way up the bay, and then turn that way until we got to the other side, and it worked. But when the wind had been around to the east or southeast for a number of days, heavy ground swells would come into bay. And ground swells were worse than wind seas, much worse. You can have a heavy ground swell and not a breath of wind blowing. And we encountered them, and they could do a lot of damage. We used to, when we had trucks on board and heavy ground swells or heavy seas, we had to tie ropes around them to keep them from turning over. And I remember when I first started on the Delmarva, at one night, they would run into Cape Charles then. And I was sleeping down below deck. I was with deckhand. And there was a straight job truck came on loaded with apples, loose apples. Well, she rounded Plantation Lighthouse going out of Cape Charles, and she overturned that truck. And man, there was applesauce all over that deck. But anyway, we ran through thick fog too, and I didn't like that at all. I'd rather have the seas where I could sort of see what I'm doing. No, there was a lot of good crossings. In fact, most of them were. Most of the weather was good in the summertime, you know. And I used to enjoy those nights of full moon shining, you know, down on the water with slick calm, you know. And I used to enjoy that. I used to walk around the deck, you know, and look out on the water. But I don't remember seeing any dolphins. I'll tell you what I do remember was shad gannets. Shad gannets is like a seagull. Only they're a big, fierce bird, and they would. That's only in the winter time. Never seen them in the summer. You could watch them, and they would fly, and all of a sudden they would dive bomb right straight down. They could see a shad under the water. Dive down, and man, they would come up with it every time. I remember one night I might have been Capt, I don't remember now. We got we left Capt Peak. When we got to Little Creek, there were some people coming and told me that they couldn't find their friend. And we looked all over that boat. I said, I don't know. Finally, he was under a bench, and I think he was drunk. I'm not sure. Now I remember back in 1956, my wife and I was building our house down here in Punkatig, and I was out there working, and I heard on the radio, I had a radio going, that the Accomack and the Northampton ran together in mid-bay, and it did a lot of damage to the Northampton. And I understand one of the passengers passed away later on as a result of that accident. And the Delmarva had an incident with a Navy ship in Little Creek Harbor. or the entrance going into Little Creek. I don't know. You know, it was sometimes in foggy weather. It was close going through those ships, concrete ships, and Capt and actually going through to Little Creek Jetty, because that was kind of narrow, you know, and the tide ran pretty good, you know, across the mouth of it, so you had to allow for that tide and so forth going into the jetty. No, except that I didn't see this, I heard that they had to stop them because they started fighting one night. And some people got hurt or something doing it in a fight, but I didn't see it. But they had them on the Pocahontas and the Princess Anne, I think. But the Delmarva never had them, to my knowledge. Hey, and the moonlight, and smooth water. It was a nice trip. It was. I can understand why people want to come down there and make that trip. I never had any dealings with her while we were working. But when I started working for Curtis Bay, somehow or other, I don't know, her niece, Alice Deagle, worked in the office there too. And Miss Washington was Nolan Chandler's secretary. And Alice Deagle got in touch with me, and she used to send me maritime magazines, you know. And so one day, Betty and I went over to see Miss Washington. And in fact, I made a little ring box and gave to her, you know. And we got pretty close, you know. And she used to get information from Vernon Ludwig. He was that worked in the office, one of the bosses in the ferry office. And she used to give me information from him about Capt and Hockaday. He was down around that ladder where Mr. Ludwig was. And but Miss Washington, Alice Deagle passed away first. And then Miss Washington passed away, but she was a nice old lady. She really was. She was secretary to Mr. Chandler. Miss Wash, they called her. I think I got the impression that she was Mr. Chandler's right-hand man, right-hand woman, you know. Yeah, one of the famous, well-known people that I met was Mickey Spillane, the author. And then I met Guy Lombardo once. I was standing right beside of him in Little Creek, standing out on the dock. And I didn't know who I was standing beside of, and one of my friends walked up and he says, "You know who you're standing beside of?" I said, "No." He said, "Guy Lombardo." Well, I made the last trip that the ferries made. That was the saddest trip I think I've ever made. Some of the crew got crying, you know. It was the end of an era. It was an end of a way of life. And I remember this old stewardess, she got crying. She says, "Oh my land, what am I going to do?" Oh, it's so sad. And it was one of the mates I was working with, Hub Summers, a good old man. He was very sad, you know, sad that it was the last trip, and it was sad too. And I remember I was on the Delmarva, and when I was out in the office before we left the dock for the last trip, and the girls in the office told me, says, when you back out, said, "Would you blow that whistle?" I said, "I sure will." I said, "I'll lay down on it." So when I went up in the pilot house and I started backing out, I laid down on that whistle. It had a Delmarva had a rope, piece of rope, you know, that it never had a handle like the Pocahontas and Princess Anne. I pulled down on that rope down and that whale, you know, and I let up on it and I'd go down on it again, you know. And when I got back to Little Creek, those girls told me and everybody, you know, got crying. But then that was somebody from the Mariners Museum that was down there. And they recorded that. They recorded that whistle.
When the Virginia ferries were sold to the Delaware River and Bay Authority in 1964, Captain Parks accepted a position with them to stay on as captain and remain there for 3 months. He then began a job with the Corps of Army Engineers as a mate on a survey boat on the Delaware River and Bay. He stayed in this job for a year before accepting a job with the Gulf Coast Transit Company as a mate. He later moved to captain aboard the tugboat Catherine Cluess. He was transporting coal and phosphates across the Gulf of Mexico between Tampa, Florida, and New Orleans, Louisiana. He was with the Gulf Coast Transit Company for 4 years. He left Gulf Coast Transit Company for a captain position with Curtis Bay Towing in Norfolk, where he worked for 17 years before retiring to his home on the eastern shore of Virginia. During this time with Curtis Bay, he was captain on every tug they had in the port of Norfolk. Now retired, Captain Parks lives in Onancock, Virginia with his wife Betty and enjoys gardening, cooking clam chowder, clam fritters, and deep frying fish. You can enjoy more of Captain Parks' stories in Episode 6 of this series, Two Captains, where Captain Belote joins Captain Parks in reminiscing about their experiences on the ferries.